All right, a story to get us started. We're going to call this the fish story. So there's a story that's told about a group of students who were new to college. It's the first day of class, and they go into their biology lab. And they sit down at tables, and they're a little bit nervous to start class. The professor walks in, greets the students, and says to the class, in front of you is a small fish. And sure enough, in the middle of each of the tables was a small fish. And the professor said, "Please observe the fish and write down your observations." And then he turned and he walked out of the room. And so the students sat there with this plate with a fish on it, and they looked at it and they were confused, puzzled. This is strange. Is this really what college is? The student took out a piece of paper and he wrote down, "I see a fish." One student said, "It's on a white plate." They were satisfied. They had done the assignment. They had observed the fish. They had looked at it. They wrote what they thought they saw. And they waited and they waited and they waited. And the professor never came back. And they waited, and the professor still did not come. And time slowly passed by, and they waited. And finally, one student looked at her watch and said, "I'm going to be late for my next class." And so she picked up her books and left. And then other students followed her lead and took off. The next day, the students come back to their biology lab, and sitting there on their tables were the same fish. And at 9 o'clock, the professor walked in, greeted the students. "Good morning. Please take out your observations of the fish." So, some students were digging in their pockets, looking in their bags. Where did I put that thing? I forgot about that. I didn't know that was an important piece. And the few students who could find their observations held them up, and the professor walked by. He didn't say anything as he read them all. And after visiting each of the students, the professor said, "Please observe the fish and write down all your observations." A student in the back, chimed in, "Hey, will there be a test on this?" But the professor didn't respond, just walked out of the door, closed it behind him, and this frustrated the students, started, talking amongst themselves. "Why doesn't he just tell us what he wants us to know?" The students looked at each other, and they were increasingly puzzled. They looked at the fish some more. Some students who had their notes, wrote a couple more things down. But for most of them, they were thinking, is this professor crazy? What is there to notice? It was just a dead fish. Then one student noticed on the professor's desk a book. The student got out of the chair, ran up to the book, looked at it, and it was like a fish identification book. So she quickly started flipping through the pages, trying to figure out what kind of fish it was in front of her. And then other students saw the book as well, and they passed the book around. They were reading these descriptions about the fish. And then after about 30 minutes, the students sat back down. They were excited. They were pleased. They thought they had mastered the assignment. And they waited, and the professor still didn't return. So at the end of the class period, the students put their notes away, and they left. On day 3, the students came back. It was the same fish on the same white plate. The professor again entered the classroom at 9 a.m. "Good morning. Please hold up your observations." The students did. They remembered their notes. Some of them were really excited, thinking they had done the work. And the professor walked around and saw each of them. And then he turned and he said, "Please observe the fish. Write down all of your observations." And he left. And the students, again, couldn't believe it. At this point, they were grumbling. They were complaining. "This guy is nuts. When is he going to teach us something? I'm paying money for this. Is this what college is?" But then students at another table really began to observe the fish more closely, and then other tables followed along. So the first thing the students started to notice was that there was an odor to this aging fish. And they recorded the details about the fish's color. that they had failed to observe in the previous 2 classes. They began asking questions about if the color was originally that way or if it had changed its appearance as it had aged. The students measured the fish. They poked at it. They described its texture. One student opened its mouth and saw that through the gills that he could see light. Another student found a small balance beam and began to weigh the fish. One student pulled out a pocket knife and began to cut open and look inside. One group found that inside of this fish in the stomach was another smaller fish. So soon, now, they were writing quickly, and their note pages were filling up and overflowing, and some students were writing 3 and 4 pages worth of notes. And finally, one student said, "Hey, class ended 10 minutes ago," and they carefully took their notes, put them in binders. They said goodbye to their fish, and they walked off, wondering if the fish would still be there when they came back on Monday. Well, when they came back on Monday, it was still there, and there was a terrible smell in the lab. The professor walked in at 9 a.m. The students threw up their hands with their papers. "Good morning," the professor said, and walked around and observed. And the students were a bit anxious as the professor walked around from student to student looking at the notes. And the professor turned and said, "All right, now we can begin." And so this is a story that was told to me when I started in college. I want you to think about this. If you had been in that bio lab class, what lessons about college and life would you have learned from this experience? When you think about what you have discovered, we often are encouraged to dig a little bit deeper, to find more, to look for even more powerful lessons, for even more meaning. So I want you to think about, what are the lessons in this story? What does it mean to fully observe? And as we apply this to our own education, are we observing the fish? Or are we still on day 1 or day 2? Are we just kind of sitting there, waiting to be spoon-fed? Or are we curious? Are we taking our resources and truly digging into the subject matter? Are we trying to become experts? Are we trying to observe all that we can? All right. I'm hoping you're getting what I'm dishing.